What happens when a power-hungry cop humiliates a quiet black woman in public, only to walk into court the next day and realize she is the judge holding his fate in her hands? This is the story of a man who thought a badge made him untouchable, and the woman who proved him wrong without ever raising her voice. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The morning unfolded with a quiet precision that spoke of discipline rather than routine. Vanessa Cole stood by the window of her modest home, the early sunlight brushing against the sharp lines of her face as she reviewed a set of neatly organized documents. Each page was aligned, every note placed exactly where it needed to be. There was no rush in her movements, no wasted motion, only a steady, deliberate rhythm shaped by years of responsibility. To anyone passing by, she would have looked like just another middle-aged woman preparing for a workday. There was nothing flashy about her, nothing that demanded attention. Her clothes were simple, understated. Her hair, neatly styled. Her posture calm, almost unremarkable. But beneath that quiet exterior lived a mind trained to dissect truth from deception, to weigh justice with unwavering clarity. Vanessa did not need to announce her authority. It lived in the way she carried silence. The neighborhood around her was just beginning to stir. A lawn sprinkler clicked rhythmically across a patch of green grass. A distant car door slammed. Somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice before settling again. It was the kind of peaceful American morning that felt untouched by conflict, the kind of morning where nothing seemed out of place. Vanessa gathered her files into a leather briefcase, her fingers brushing lightly across the edges as if confirming their presence without needing to look. Today mattered, not because of any single case, but because every day she stepped into that courtroom, she carried the weight of a system that too often failed people who looked like her. She paused briefly near the mirror by the door, adjusting the collar of her blouse. Her eyes met her reflection, steady, unreadable, grounded. There was no trace of hesitation, only a quiet readiness. She reached for her keys and stepped outside, locking the door behind her with a soft click that echoed faintly in the still air. As she walked toward her car, there was nothing about her that would have drawn suspicion, nothing that suggested power, nothing that warned anyone watching that they were looking at a federal judge with the authority to change lives with a single sentence. And yet, somewhere not far from that quiet street, a man wearing a badge was already moving through his morning with a very different kind of certainty, the kind built on assumption, on control, on the belief that some people could be handled without consequence. Their paths had not crossed yet, but the moment they did, everything would begin to shift. Officer Ryan Haskins leaned against the hood of his patrol car, just 2 blocks from the courthouse, the morning sun glinting off his badge as he scanned the street with a practiced, territorial gaze. His jaw tightened slightly as he watched people pass. Workers, lawyers, clerks, most of them moving with purpose, with belonging. He had walked this area for years, long enough to believe he understood exactly who fit and who did not. To him, order was not about law. It was about control. And control, in his mind, required constant enforcement. His fingers tapped idly against his radio before stilling as his eyes locked onto Vanessa Cole approaching from down sidewalk. There was nothing outwardly remarkable about her. No uniform, no visible credentials, no signal of authority. Just a black woman walking alone, composed, self-contained, carrying a briefcase that looked too refined for what he assumed her place to be. Something about her calm unsettled him. It was not fear, not hesitation. It was the absence of both. Haskins pushed himself off the hood of the car, boots hitting the pavement with deliberate weight as he stepped into her path, forcing her to slow. "Morning," he said, though there was no warmth in it, only a thin layer of politeness stretched over suspicion. Vanessa stopped, her posture straight, her expression neutral. "Good morning, officer," she replied evenly, her voice steady, unhurried. Haskins circled slightly, not enough to be obvious, but enough to assert presence. His eyes moved from her face to the briefcase, then back again, searching for something he could justify. You headed somewhere specific? He asked, tilting his head, his tone sharpening just enough to test her response. Vanessa met his gaze without flinching. Yes, she said. I'm on my way to work. The simplicity of her answer seemed to irritate him. His lips pressed into a thin line. Work? Huh? He repeated, letting the word hang in the air like a challenge. Mind telling me where that is? Vanessa's fingers adjusted slightly on the handle of her briefcase, but her voice did not change. The courthouse, she answered. A faint scoff slipped from Haskins before he could stop it. He took a step closer, closing the space in a way that felt less like conversation and more like pressure. That's so, he said. You do not look like you belong walking in there like you own the place. The words landed with quiet force, not shouted, but edged with something colder, assumption wrapped in authority. A couple passing nearby slowed for half a second before continuing on, their silence a familiar kind of complicity. Vanessa did not react the way he expected. No anger, no defensiveness. Just a measured breath. I'm simply going to do my job, she said. Haskins studied her, irritation building beneath the surface. Her calm was not submission. It felt like resistance, the kind that did not need volume to be felt. His hand rested near his belt as he leaned in slightly, voice lowering. Well, I think we need to figure out exactly what kind of job that is, he said. Because right now, something about you does not add up. The street seemed quieter in that moment, the ordinary rhythm of the morning shifting just enough to make space for what was about to unfold. Vanessa stood her ground, still, composed, while the man in front of her began to tighten his grip on a situation he did not yet understand, and had already started to lose control of. Haskins straightened slightly, as if the decision had already been made in his mind, and everything that followed was just procedure catching up to his assumption. His fingers curled briefly against his belt before he gestured toward the patrol car with a sharp tilt of his head. Go ahead and set that briefcase down, he said, the politeness from earlier gone now, replaced by something firmer, more commanding. Vanessa did not move immediately. She held his gaze for a fraction longer, not in defiance, but in quiet acknowledgement of what he was choosing to do. Then, with measured control, she lowered the briefcase to the ground beside her feet. The motion was slow, deliberate, leaving no room for misinterpretation. Is there a reason for this? She asked, her tone even, her words precise. Haskins let out a short breath through his nose, as if the question itself annoyed him. Yeah, he replied, stepping closer, his presence pressing into her space again. The reason is you are acting real comfortable in a place where most people would at least try to explain themselves better. His eyes flicked toward the courthouse in the distance, then back to her. And I do not like things that do not add up. Vanessa kept her hands visible, relaxed at her sides, her posture unchanged. I have answered your questions, she said calmly. I am on my way to work. That is all. Haskins shook his head slowly, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. But there was tension behind it now, something sharper beginning to surface. No, that is not all, he said. See, people who belong around here, they do not hesitate like that. They do not give half answers. They know how to talk to law enforcement. His voice dropped slightly, each word more pointed than the last. And right now, you are making me think you have something to hide. A passing car slowed just enough for the driver to glance over, then sped up again, unwilling to get involved. The street felt narrower somehow, the space between them charged with something that was no longer just suspicion. It was control tightening its grip. Vanessa inhaled slowly, her shoulders rising just a fraction before settling again. Officer, she said, her voice still steady, there is nothing for you to investigate. I have done nothing wrong. The certainty in her words did not calm him. It irritated him further. Haskins stepped in closer, close enough now that his shadow fell across her entirely, cutting her off from the sunlight. That is not for you to decide, he said. Without waiting for a response, he reached down and nudged the briefcase lightly with the toe of his boot, as if testing it, as if expecting it to reveal something on its own. Open it, he ordered. Vanessa's eyes followed the movement, then returned to his face. There was no rush in her reaction, no panic, only a quiet stillness that seemed to resist the pace he was trying to force. "I will comply," she said, "but I would like to understand what grounds you are acting on." That question, calm, direct, undeniable, landed harder than any raised voice could have. For a brief second, something flickered across Haskins's face. Not doubt, not quite. More like irritation at being asked to justify himself. It passed quickly. His expression hardened again, jaw tightening as he leaned forward just enough to make his authority unmistakable. "The grounds," he said slowly, "are that I said so." The words hung in the air, heavy and final. And in that moment, the line between routine and abuse disappeared completely. Vanessa bent down, unlatched the briefcase with careful hands, and began to open it, fully aware that whatever came next was no longer about law. It was about a man who had already decided she did not belong and was determined to prove it, no matter the cost. The latch clicked open with a soft, controlled sound that seemed almost out of place against the tension tightening around them. Vanessa lifted the lid of the briefcase slowly, revealing neatly stacked legal documents, folders aligned with exacting precision, each page tabbed and marked. There was nothing chaotic inside, nothing suspicious, only order. Haskins leaned in, his eyes scanning quickly at first, then narrowing as the contents failed to match the story he had already constructed in his head. "What is all this?" he muttered, flipping one of the folders open without asking, his movements rough, careless. Vanessa remained still, watching him, her expression unchanged. "Work files," she said evenly. "As I told you." Haskins's fingers moved through the papers, less like an investigation and more like a search for justification. His breathing grew slightly heavier, not from exertion, but from frustration. He needed something, anything, to validate the authority he had already asserted. When he found nothing, his jaw tightened, and he snapped the folder shut with more force than necessary. "Stand up," he ordered abruptly. Vanessa, who had been crouched beside the briefcase, rose smoothly to her full height, her movements controlled, unhurried. She did not ask why this time. She did not need to. Haskins stepped back just enough to create space, then motioned toward the patrol car again. "You are coming with me," he said. "We're going to sort this out properly." The words carried a finality that left no room for discussion, though there was still no legal basis behind them. Vanessa's gaze remained steady. "Am I being detained?" she asked, her voice calm but unmistakably clear. The question hung there, precise and deliberate. Haskins's lips pressed into a thin line. He did not like questions that required accountability. "You are being brought in for further questioning," he replied, sidestepping the legality of it entirely. "Now, turn around." For the first time, a faint pause entered Vanessa's posture. Not hesitation, but recognition. This was no longer a misunderstanding. This was a decision. Slowly, she turned, placing her hands behind her back without resistance. The compliance was exact, controlled, leaving him no excuse to escalate further. Yet somehow, that only seemed to irritate him more. Haskins stepped in, gripping her wrists with a firmness that bordered on unnecessary, his fingers tightening as he secured them together. The pressure lingered a moment longer than required, a silent assertion of dominance. Nearby, a woman exiting a nearby building slowed, her eyes flicking between them, uncertainty written across her face before she quickly looked away and kept walking. Vanessa stood still, her breathing steady, her chin level. There was no struggle, no raised voice, only a quiet presence that refused to break under the weight of his actions. Haskins guided, no, pushed her toward the patrol car, his hand pressing against her upper arm to direct her movement. "Watch your step," he said, though the tone carried no concern, only command. He opened the back door and motioned for her to get in. Vanessa lowered herself into the seat without resistance, her movements as composed as they had been from the beginning. The door shut with a heavy thud that echoed faintly down the street. For a brief second, the world outside seemed to resume its normal rhythm. Cars passing, footsteps continuing, life moving on as if nothing had happened. But inside that patrol car, something irreversible had already begun. And though Haskins believed he was tightening control, every decision he made was quietly building toward a reckoning he could not yet see. The patrol car rolled to a stop behind the precinct building, its engine idling for a moment before Haskins shut it off with a sharp turn of the key. The sudden silence inside the vehicle felt heavy, almost deliberate. Vanessa remained seated in the back, hands secured behind her, posture straight despite the confined space. She did not ask questions. She did not plead. She simply waited. Haskins stepped out, adjusted his uniform with a quick tug, then opened the rear door. "Out," he said flatly. Vanessa complied without hesitation, stepping carefully onto the pavement. The station loomed ahead, brick walls, narrow windows, a place that carried authority not just in structure, but in reputation. Inside, the air was cooler, filled with the low hum of fluorescent lights and distant voices echoing down the hallway. A few officers glanced up as Haskins escorted her in. Their eyes lingered, curiosity flickering across their faces, but no one intervened. It was a familiar dynamic. Questions left unasked, lines left uncrossed. "Processing room," Haskins muttered to a passing officer, who gave a brief nod and kept moving. The room itself was sterile, functional. A metal chair bolted to the floor. A counter cluttered with paperwork. A wall mirror that reflected everything without emotion. Haskins guided Vanessa toward the chair, pressing down lightly on her shoulder to seat her. The gesture was unnecessary. She would have sat regardless. Still, he did anyway. "Let us make this quick," he said, reaching for a clipboard. "Name." Vanessa looked straight ahead. "Vanessa Cole." He scribbled it down, barely listening. "Occupation." A brief pause. Not hesitation, calculation. "Public service," she replied. The answer seemed to irritate him. He glanced up, eyes narrowing. "You people always have vague answers," he said under his breath, loud enough to be heard. He set the clipboard down harder than needed, then turned toward a cabinet along the wall. "Stand up," he ordered again. Vanessa rose smoothly, her movements still controlled, still composed. Haskins stepped behind her, unlocking the cuffs, but keeping a firm grip on her arm, as if expecting resistance that never came. "Standard procedure," he said, though nothing about his tone suggested professionalism. "We document, we process, we make sure you're not hiding anything." His words blurred into justification. From the cabinet, he pulled out a small electric clipper, its dull plastic surface catching the overhead light. The sound it made when he switched it on was low, steady, a mechanical buzz that seemed to settle into the room like an unspoken threat. Vanessa's eyes flicked briefly toward the mirror, catching her own reflection for a fraction of a second before returning forward. "This is unnecessary," she said calmly. Haskins stepped closer, his presence pressing in again. "No," he replied, his voice edged with something colder now, something personal. "What is unnecessary is people thinking they can walk around like they are above the system. Without waiting for permission, without offering explanation beyond his own distorted logic." He reached forward. The clippers touched her hair. The first pass was deliberate, slow, the sound cutting through the quiet room as strands fell away. A nearby officer, half visible through the doorway, paused just long enough to register what was happening, then looked away. Vanessa did not flinch. She did not pull back. She stood there, still as stone, as the humiliation unfolded piece by piece. The air carried the faint scent of cut hair, the soft patter of it falling to the floor marking each second that passed. Haskins worked methodically, as if proving a point only he understood, his movements growing more confident with each pass. "There," he muttered finally, stepping back, switching off the clippers. The silence that followed was heavier than before. Vanessa remained standing, her head now bare, her posture unchanged. Slowly, she lifted her gaze to the mirror again, taking in the reflection, not with shock, not with anger, but with a quiet, unshaken resolve. And in that stillness, something far more powerful than resistance began to take shape, even as Haskins remained completely unaware of the line he had just crossed. The room remained still after the clippers fell silent, the weight of what had just happened lingering in the air like something unfinished. Vanessa stood facing the mirror, her reflection stark now, stripped of anything ornamental, yet somehow more imposing in its simplicity. There was no tremor in her posture, no visible crack in her composure. Behind her, Haskins set the clippers down with a casual clatter, rolling his shoulders as if he had just completed a routine task. "That should help you remember how things work around here," he said, his tone laced with a smug satisfaction that came from believing he had established dominance. He reached for the clipboard again, flipping through a few forms with quick, impatient motions. Papers shuffled, a pen clicked, the mundane sounds of bureaucracy attempting to mask the severity of what had just taken place. "We're going to write this up," he continued, barely glancing at her. "Failure to identify properly, suspicious behavior, noncompliance. Nothing too serious if you cooperate moving forward." He spoke as if the outcome had already been decided, as if the system would naturally bend to support whatever narrative he chose to construct. Vanessa turned slowly from the mirror to face him, her movements unhurried, her gaze steady. For the first time since entering the station, there was a shift, not in her control, but in her intention. She stepped forward slightly, just enough to bring herself fully into his line of sight. "Officer Haskins," she said, her voice calm, measured, but carrying a clarity that cut through the room more sharply than any raised tone could have. He paused, pen hovering above the paper, more out of mild annoyance than attention. "What?" he replied. Vanessa held his gaze, unblinking. "You still have an opportunity to stop this," she said. The words were not loud, not dramatic, but they carried weight, deliberate, precise. "You can correct your report. You can release me now, and you can walk away from a decision that will follow you for the rest of your life." The room seemed to narrow around them. A nearby officer glanced over from his desk, sensing something different in the tone, though he said nothing. Haskins stared at her for a moment, then let out a dry, dismissive breath, the corner of his mouth lifting in a faint, incredulous smirk. "Is that supposed to be a threat?" he asked, leaning back slightly, his posture loosening with misplaced confidence. Vanessa did not respond immediately. She simply watched him, her expression unreadable, her presence unwavering. "It is not a threat," she said finally. "It is a warning." The distinction hung between them, clear and undeniable. Haskins chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as if amused by the audacity of it. He set the clipboard down with a light tap, stepping closer again, closing the space in a way that was meant to reassert control. "Let me make something very clear," he said, his voice dropping, each word sharpened by irritation. "You do not get to walk in here, act like you are above everyone, and then tell me how to do my job." His eyes scanned her face briefly, lingering on the freshly shaved head, as if expecting to see shame, regret, anything he could interpret as victory. He found none. That seemed to irritate him more. "You should have thought about consequences before you started playing games," he added, turning back toward the paperwork. "Now you're going to sit down, you're going to sign what I put in front of you, and then maybe we will decide what happens next." Vanessa remained standing for a moment longer, then slowly took the seat again without resistance. The metal chair scraped faintly against the floor. Her hands rested calmly in her lap, her posture unchanged. She had said what needed to be said. The final door had been offered, and as Haskins picked up his pen and began writing, dismissing her words as nothing more than empty defiance, he sealed it shut himself. Unaware that the consequences he had just laughed off were already in motion, waiting just beyond the walls of the very courthouse he believed she did not belong in. The pen scratched steadily against the paper as Haskins continued writing, each stroke careless, confident, final in his mind. Across from him, Vanessa sat in complete stillness, her hands resting lightly in her lap, her gaze no longer fixed on him but somewhere beyond, as if the room itself had already lost relevance. The fluorescent lights hummed faintly overhead, and for a moment, everything felt suspended, routine, predictable, contained. Then the door opened. Not abruptly, not with force, but with a quiet authority that immediately shifted the air. A senior officer stepped in first, his posture rigid, his expression unusually tense. Behind him followed two men in dark suits, their presence unmistakable, their movements precise and deliberate. The casual noise of the precinct seemed to dim around them. Conversations lowered. Chairs stilled. Haskins did not look up at first, too absorbed in finishing his report. "We are in the middle of processing," he muttered, irritation creeping into his voice. "You will have to wait." No one responded. The silence stretched, heavy and unfamiliar. Something in that silence finally pulled his attention upward. His eyes moved from the polished shoes of the men standing before him to their faces, stern, focused, not here for discussion. Then one of them spoke. Officer Ryan Haskins. The man said, his tone controlled, carrying the weight of authority that did not need to be raised. "Step away from the desk." The words did not register immediately. Haskins blinked once, then frowned, his grip tightening slightly around the pen. "Excuse me," he replied, a faint edge of confusion breaking through his earlier certainty. The senior officer took a step forward, his voice lower now but firmer. "Step away. Now." Something shifted in Haskins's chest, subtle at first, then sharper. He pushed his chair back slowly, the legs scraping against the floor with a sound that felt louder than it should have. His eyes flicked toward Vanessa, searching for something, anything that would explain this sudden change. She was already standing, calm, composed, untouched by the chaos beginning to form around her. One of the suited men moved to her side, his posture respectful, almost deferential. "Your Honor," he said quietly. The word landed like a fracture in the room. Haskins's breath caught, not dramatically, but enough to break his rhythm. His eyes snapped back to Vanessa, his mind struggling to reconcile the woman in front of him with the word he had just heard. "No," he muttered under his breath, the certainty gone now, replaced by something unsteady, something unraveling. Vanessa turned to face him fully. There was no anger in her expression, no triumph, only clarity. "My name is Judge Vanessa Cole," she said, her voice even, each word precise. "Federal court." The room seemed to tilt around him. The report on the desk, the clippers on the counter, the scattered papers, every detail he had controlled moments ago now felt distant, disconnected. His fingers loosened, the pen slipping slightly in his grasp. That is not," he began, but the words faltered before they could form into anything coherent. His mind raced backward, replaying every decision, every word, every action. The stop, the search, the arrest, the humiliation. The realization did not arrive all at once. It crept in piece by piece until there was no space left for denial. The senior officer stepped closer, his voice cutting through the silence. "You will remove yourself from this situation immediately," he said, "and you will prepare to answer for what you have done." Haskins did not move right away. His body felt heavier, slower, as if the weight of the moment had settled into his bones. His eyes remained locked on Vanessa, searching for something, an out, a mistake, a way to undo what had already been done. There was none, and in that stillness, the certainty he had carried all morning collapsed completely, leaving behind only the cold, unmistakable understanding that he had not just crossed a line, he had stepped directly into his own downfall. The room did not erupt into chaos. Instead, it collapsed into a suffocating stillness that pressed down on everyone inside it. Haskins stood frozen for a fraction too long, his hands hovering uselessly at his sides, as if waiting for someone to correct what had just been said. No one did. The senior officer's expression hardened further, and with a subtle motion of his hand, two internal affairs investigators stepped forward. "Officer Ryan Haskins," one of them said, his voice measured, carrying the unmistakable tone of procedure already in motion. "You are being relieved of duty, effective immediately." The words landed with finality. Not a warning, not a threat, a conclusion. Haskins blinked, his throat tightening as the reality began to settle in. This is a misunderstanding," he said, though the conviction in his voice had already begun to fracture. His eyes darted briefly toward Vanessa. Judge Cole now, searching for any sign of mercy, any indication that this could still be undone. She offered none. She simply watched, her posture composed, her presence steady, as the system he had abused began to turn back on him. "Turn around," the investigator instructed. The command was calm, professional, the same kind of instruction Haskins himself had given countless times. For a brief moment, he hesitated. That hesitation said everything. The senior officer stepped closer, his tone lowering, losing even the thin layer of patience that had remained. "Do not make this worse," he said. Slowly, as if his body no longer belonged to him, Haskins turned. His shoulders, once squared with confidence, now sagged under a weight he could no longer deny. The cold steel closed around his wrists, tight, precise, inescapable. The sound was quiet, but it echoed louder than anything else in the room. A few officers nearby shifted uncomfortably, some lowering their eyes, others watching with a kind of stunned silence. No one spoke up for him. Not now. Not anymore. The investigator began reciting charges, each one clear, deliberate, unavoidable. Abuse of authority, unlawful detention, violation of civil rights, conduct unbecoming of an officer. Each phrase stripped something away, piece by piece, until there was nothing left of the authority he had wielded just moments before. Haskins swallowed hard, his breathing uneven now, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "I did not know," he said quietly, almost to himself. "I did not know who she was." The investigator did not respond. He did not need to. The truth of it hung there, hollow and meaningless, because it was never about who she was. It was about what he chose to do when he believed she had no power at all. Vanessa stepped forward then, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the same controlled presence she had carried from the beginning. The room seemed to part for her without instruction. She stopped just a few feet from Haskins, her gaze steady, her voice calm. "That was your mistake," she said. "Not cruel, not loud, just absolute." Haskins lowered his eyes, unable to meet hers now, the weight of the moment pressing down on him from every direction. The investigators guided him toward the door, his steps unsteady, his posture no longer commanding but diminished, reduced. As he was led out, the precinct remained silent, the kind of silence that follows something irreversible. Behind him, Judge Vanessa Cole stood unmoved, her presence restored not by force, but by truth. And in that quiet, undeniable moment, justice had already begun its work. The heavy door of the precinct closed behind Officer Ryan Haskins with a dull, final thud that seemed to echo longer than it should have, as if the building itself was marking the end of something that had gone unchecked for far too long. Inside, the tension that had once filled the room began to dissolve, not abruptly, but gradually, like a storm receding into the distance. Conversations resumed in low voices, cautious at first, then steadier, as if everyone present was recalibrating to a new reality, one where authority was no longer assumed, but accountable. Judge Vanessa Cole remained where she stood for a moment longer, her presence anchoring the space in a quiet, undeniable way. The fluorescent lights still hummed overhead, the same as before, yet the room felt different now, cleaner, clearer, as if something heavy had been lifted. A young officer near the back of the room straightened unconsciously, his posture shifting from passive observation to something closer to respect. No one needed to be told who she was anymore. It was understood. One of the investigators stepped toward her, his voice measured, carrying a tone that balanced professionalism with something more human. "Judge Cole, we will ensure a full report is filed immediately. What happened here will not be overlooked." Vanessa inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the statement without dramatics. "See that it is handled properly," she replied, her voice calm, steady, carrying the same quiet authority that had never left her. There was no anger in her words, no need to emphasize what had already been made clear. Justice, once set in motion, did not require repetition. She turned then, her movements unhurried, and reached for her briefcase, which had been carefully placed on a nearby desk. The leather surface was still smooth, still ordered, untouched by the chaos that had surrounded it earlier. She picked it up with the same deliberate care as before, her fingers brushing lightly along its edge, grounding herself in the familiar rhythm of control and purpose. As she moved toward the exit, the room subtly shifted again. Officers stepped aside without being asked. Conversations paused just long enough to acknowledge her passing. There were no grand gestures, no spoken apologies, yet the change was unmistakable, a silent recognition of what had been done and what had been corrected. Outside, the morning had advanced, the sun now higher in the sky, casting a steady, even light across the courthouse steps in the distance. The world had not stopped. It rarely did, but something within it had been set right. Vanessa stepped into that light without hesitation, her posture straight, her pace measured. The absence of her hair did not diminish her presence. If anything, it sharpened it, revealing the strength that had always been there, unshaken, unyielding. She did not look back. There was nothing behind her that required revisiting. Ahead, the courthouse stood as it always had, columns rising, doors open, a place where decisions were made not by force, but by principle. Vanessa ascended the steps with quiet certainty, each step carrying the weight of experience, of resilience, of truth. By the time she reached the entrance, the noise of the precinct had already faded into the background, replaced by the steady rhythm of justice continuing its course. And as she walked through those doors, returning not as a victim, but as the authority she had always been, the balance that had been disrupted was restored. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with the kind of calm finality that only true justice can deliver.